Fellas, in today's video, we're going to be talking about the Washington Wizards. There's been a lot of people spamming me in Twitter mentions and Instagram messages and things like that, asking me to talk about Washington. They've won 7 in a row. They've won 9 of the last 10, and one of those wins includes a win over the Utah Jazz as well, a game in which Donovan Mitchell had like 40-plus points. So there's some momentum here for Washington to start to do something here towards the end of the season. As they're making a playoff push, they're almost certainly going to be in the play-in game at this point if they continue to play the way that they are. And the possibility exists that this could be a scary team in the postseason as well, with the very obvious guard talent that they have. So we're going to talk about the Washington Wizards in the first video of the day. But really quickly, before we get started, if you enjoy content like this, then consider subscribing. I upload twice a day, every single day on the channel, so it's a great place for the most consistent NBA content on YouTube. If you're new here, by the way, what's up? My name is Tucker. You can also leave a like rating in the video as well, and you can check me out at various socials and a Linktree link in the description below. With all those things said, let's talk about Washington. So some quick things I mentioned in the intro. 7 wins in a row, won 9 of the last 10, including a win over the Jazz. And that poses the question, Washington's kind of scary. No, they obviously have a good amount of talent here. This is a team that I thought before the season was going to worst case be a playoff team, a top 8 team in the Eastern Conference, and it just didn't quite work out that way for them. They started the year off very slowly. They had a lot of protocol issues. They just weren't even playing games there for a little while, but lately they've started to figure it out. I'm sure a lot of you guys are wondering, okay, Tucker, well what's going differently? What have they figured out here in Washington that's allowed them to play better? There's not really a complicated answer to this. Bradley Beal and Russell Westbrook have been playing extremely well, and they're not really guarding, significantly better than they were before. Just those guys are playing. They're on the same page, and there's been some other stuff, that we'll talk about here in a little bit in terms of some other players stepping up and things like that. But the answer for the most part for Washington is, are Bradley Beal and Russell Westbrook playing well and shooting well? And if the answer to that is yes, they're competitive in a lot of these games. Granted, the schedule hasn't been the most grueling over the last 9 or 10 games, but it does include a win over Utah, as I mentioned, and a couple of other at least half-decent NBA teams as well. Now, some of the other stuff that's happening here is in those games in which maybe Russell Westbrook has a bad shooting night, guys like Davis Bertans, guys like Daniel Gafford, there's been a lot of good Daniel Gafford stuff over the last 10 games or so. Those guys are stepping up and they're playing well, and they're allowing some occasional off nights from Russ and from Bradley Beal if they need it in order to make this work. And this is all very, very interesting, right? For a couple of reasons. One, Beal and Westbrook, despite if you have, flaws or issues with Westbrook or with Beal, you can't deny the fact they do have plenty of experience in big-time playoff games. Maybe not recently for someone like Bradley Beal, but he has been in some big playoff games, as has Russell Westbrook. And these guys bring a level of experience and a talent level to the postseason for this Washington group that could lead you to believe that maybe they're going to be a sleeper in the Eastern Conference postseason. Now, for me personally, I'm a little bit biased here, granted that I'm a Nets fan. I'm not buying into that narrative yet. Now, if they win 15 in a row going into the postseason, that's completely different, and they'll be shooting up the standings, right? But assuming that they're in either the 7 or the 8 spot, I'm not overly concerned about Washington potentially making a run here. Maybe they make a few games in the first round interesting, but if they run into Philly or Brooklyn, assuming that both those teams are fully healthy in the first round, then this Washington team is probably not going to make very much noise. Beyond that, if you want to make a case for them to do something against potentially Milwaukee, I'm not saying they're going to do it. I'm just saying I would kind of listen, okay? And then in the 4-5, whether that's, the Knicks, the Hawks, the Celtics, any combination of teams here, things could start to get interesting. I'm not saying that they're as good as Atlanta or as good as Boston, but I don't think that the gap is really that large. When we get to this point in the season and they've got, that top tier talent, when the rotations are going to be shortened and you have guys that have playoff experience, I could see them making a series against Boston or Atlanta or New York very, very interesting. Okay. Now, kind of coming into play for all of this, I've made a lot of Washington videos this season, and pretty much none of them have been focused on this season because this season was just kind of a wash, right? Despite, whatever Bradley Beal and Russell Westbrook could have done individually, they just weren't playing together enough. And it kind of spelled out a pretty clear scenario here where Bradley Beal was going to be gone this offseason or by next trade deadline, and things are going to change pretty drastically for Washington after that. Now, this recent stretch, winning 7 games in a row, does not change my mind on that, just to be absolutely clear. I still think, even if they win a first-round series in the postseason, I still think Bradley Beal is gone this offseason or prior to the next trade deadline, assuming he does not sign an extension with Washington this offseason. I would be shocked if Washington let him run out his contract and let him test free agency in the summer of 2022. So with those things in mind, even though it's a nice little stretch here, I don't know that the long-term impact is going to be all that significant on this roster. I think there might be some Washington fans that are looking at this recent stretch and thinking, hey, we're figuring it out. We're showing Bradley Beal that we're a franchise that can make some things work. We might be able to retain this guy. I would caution against that optimism at this point, okay? And the points that I made in that Westbrook video not too long ago, I think still stand. If Russell Westbrook is still on Washington when Bradley Beal gets moved, it's going to be a really weird situation given his contract, given his trade value, all those different things. It gets difficult to move a guy like Westbrook, and ultimately, his time as a relevant NBA basketball player would probably be over at that point. But I will give him some credit. Him and Beal are both playing extremely well. Statistically, it looks great. They're defending slightly better. And again, there have been some interesting little wrinkles here where Bertans was really, really struggling in the beginning of the season. He started to have some of those better shooting nights now where he's starting to, get to 15 to 20 points, on any given night. The Daniel Gafford stuff has been fun. And I'm sure there are some Bulls fans watching this thinking, why exactly did we give up Daniel Gafford? For, not a whole lot here. Like, why did we just give up on this guy? Now, granted, this has happened a few times in Washington and as well as other teams where they get a young guy, they play well initially, and it's only because they kind of need them to play. At the 5 spot there in Washington, there's not a ton of options there given the Thomas Bryant stuff. So I wouldn't start jumping for joy and saying that Daniel Gafford's going to be like a future All-Star or anything, but he's been an interesting piece on a team that certainly needs an influx of young talent. Outside of that, the Denny injury is unfortunate. Denny is in such a weird spot because I feel like when I watch him, there's a lot of fluidity and a lot of understanding of the game. But he's so often just kind of stuck in the corner that it's really difficult to fully evaluate him at this point. And Rui is a guy that I've also really liked, since he was drafted because he's just been such a solid player. I just didn't know how much upside he really provided them. And it's just nice that he's out there, provide them some size, a little bit of scoring and shot making. But ultimately, whatever happens the rest of the way for Washington is going to be 100% related to whatever Bradley Beal and Russell Westbrook can provide to this team. If they are out of this world, awesome, fantastic, all NBA level the rest of the way as well as in the postseason, this Washington team is going to be heard from the rest of the way, and they're not going to be a team that's going to just go quietly in the first round. You know what I mean? If those guys are not playing particularly well, if someone twists an ankle, if they start missing games, if they don't finish the season especially strong, maybe they're in the play-in game and they're out after 1 game or 2 games, right? Here's what I would say. Given the postseason experience, given the talent level of these two players, they would not be at the top of the list for me amongst teams that I would like to play if I was one of those top seeds in the Eastern Conference. Not that I'm necessarily afraid of them, but just the ability for those guys to go off on a game-to-game basis is not something that I really want to mess with or deal with. And I think it's one of the reasons why the play-in game is such an interesting aspect of this season, for this season specifically. And Washington is a perfect example of this as well. They're a team that has been heavily negatively impacted by the circumstances of this season, right? And that hasn't necessarily been the case on the exact same level for other teams as it has been for Washington. So giving them an opportunity, right, to prove this 72-game sample size wrong and say, no, we're actually a real legit playoff team, and we might end up with the 9th seed, but we're going to prove it in this small little play-in tournament that we're actually one of the top 8 teams in our conference. We just got really messed up with the protocol stuff at the beginning of the season. They're a perfect example of why, for this season specifically, the play-in tournament works and it makes sense conceptually. Now, you can make the argument about injuries and too many games played and stuff like that, and absolutely that should be considered. And I'm not sure the play-in tournament is a great idea from a competitive standpoint outside of a season like this, and hopefully we never get a season like this ever again. So if you want to argue against it overall, I can hear that argument. But for this season specifically, from a competitive standpoint, this Washington team is a perfect example of why the play-in tournament is a good idea, again, specifically for this season. Because there's a scenario here where Washington ends up with the 9th or the 10th seed in a normal postseason. They wouldn't even make the playoffs, when realistically they're a team that can make noise depending on how those top 2 guys are playing, right? So at the end of the day, I'm not necessarily saying that I'm an all-time believer in this Washington team, but what I am saying is that they would make me a little bit nervous if I was one of those top teams because of that Beal and Westbrook factor. And this recent stretch of games has shown that when those 2 guys are clicking and they're on the same page, they can be tough to beat, even if they're not guarding particularly well. Like I said, Donovan Mitchell getting like 44 points on him the other night. And then even if they're not playing at 100%, guys like, I know, Daniel Gafford out of nowhere and Davis Bertans can step it up for them. Okay, so keep an eye on Washington. We'll see how they finish the year. It's possible they move up even outside, or even above the play-in game because of how congested the standings are in the Eastern Conference. We'll continue to keep an eye on them the rest of the way. But that is going to be the end of the first video of the day today, and I thank you guys very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. As I said, I upload twice a day, every single day, and this channel is the most consistent NBA content on YouTube. Consider subscribing. If you are enjoying the content, leave a like rating as well. Check me out at various socials, link down in the description below. As I said, my name is Tucker. Hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your Sunday, and I will see you all next time.